Have you ever had your VO2 max tested?
I actually don't score that well on that test because I never work at that level. I am a diesel engine, fat burning all day. You know, if I have to run across the street because I'm going to get hit by a car, I would bet the car would hit me.
It's such a big thing that you did that you just jumped right into a 100-kilometer race. It's cool when you hear these stories that had you not done that, the path you would have chosen could have been completely different. To not be afraid to jump into things like that and fear failure. I just feel like a lot of the people we've talked to, Tony, it's like that's the common theme. At the very beginning of whatever they accomplished, there was a moment where there wasn't hesitation and they just did it. And then it opened up all these doors. You're listening to the Born Primitive Podcast. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the Born Primitive Podcast. We have a rare evening recording for us.
Yeah, you just said good morning there.
Oh, shoot. That's what I always do.
Hey, that's all right.
Good evening, everyone. Yeah. Welcome to the Born Primitive Podcast. But our guest is out in Melbourne, Australia, or as they say, Melbourne. So I think it's 7 a.m. over there. So we appreciate her coming on. But today's guest we're really excited for. She is an ultra runner. She's kind of carved out her name in the endurance sports space. As I mentioned, she is a native of Australia. And she has recently taken on the challenge of doing Ironmans, which is totally nuts. This year, she finished the legendary Ultra-Trail du Mont-Blanc. Hopefully, I'm pronouncing that right. And then headed to Nice to tackle the 2024 Ironman World Championships. And then that was within a span of a few weeks. So we want to dive into her journey from ultra runner to triathlete, how she navigated that transition, and what drives her to push the boundaries of endurance sports. And for those that have dabbled in that sport, it requires tremendous mental toughness. Of course, the physical demand is there, but I see that as a pure mental game, and the people we have brought on from that space absolutely prove that. So, Lucy Bartholomew, welcome to the Born Primitive Podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
How's Australia? I'm a little jealous.
Yeah, well, I've been back a week now from France, so it's been beautiful weather. Summer's coming up, so it's good to be here.
Yeah, because you guys are the opposite. So you got summer coming.
We're going into summer.
Yeah, love that. Well, what got you into endurance sports? Where did it all start?
So it all started for me with my dad. So I ran my first 100 kilometers alongside my father. He was 50 and I was 16 years old. And we ran along the coastline of Victoria in Australia. But rewinding before that, how I got onto that start line is that he signed up for his first 100K. He's always been like a marathon runner on the roads. And as he was getting older and slower, he was kind of looking for some different challenges. And so he found this race in the Blue Mountains in Sydney. And I saw him sign up and start training for it. And at first I was completely disinterested. I was just like, what is that ridiculous distance? I didn't have a concept of what 100 kilometers was. And I saw him going away on these cool excursions to the bush, and he'd come back with these cool stories of seeing kangaroos and wombats, and he'd camp and he'd go to these cool cafes, and ultimately got inspired to come along on my bike with him. And so I'd ride next to him as he was running. And then I kind of saw that what he was really doing was going walking in the bush and eating a lot. And I was like, oh, running is a very loose term when you start going further and further. And so he started taking on some more technical trails. I ditched the bike. I kind of walked with him. And I went up and saw him complete the race in the Blue Mountains. And seeing him finish was amazing, but seeing like the final finishes, the ones who were fighting cutoff, I just saw people of all different age, shapes, sizes, backgrounds, and kind of thought, wow, if they can do it, why can't I? And so on the train back from the Blue Mountains back to Sydney Airport, I emailed every race director of 100-kilometer races in Australia. And one of them came back because of my age, being under 18. And they said, you can run as long as you do it next to your father and kind of do all these other hurdles to get to the start line. And I did that race, 12 and a half hours we spent together running along the coast together. And I finished being like, that was cool, but he held me back. I want to do it by myself, and looked for the next race that would take me.
And that was 100 kilometers?
Correct.
So for us Americans, let's see, what is it, 5/8? So 8/5. So it's
62
62 and a half,
62,
right?
Yeah.
62.5.
Yes.
Ooh, and
Mhm.
you just rolled into that, huh? Like, like you had to have some running background, right?
I mean, the 2 weeks before the race, I did a 50 kilometer through a 30-mile run just to be like, if I can do half the distance, then I can do double the distance. It was kind of, I had a freak out of like, I don't know if I can do this. And then I ran 50 Ks and I was like, oh, I can do this. Like, for some reason, I really put down that I was so blissfully unaware. When you tell someone that you run, and if I say I run 100 Ks, people are like, I get tired driving that far. And I was so young, I wasn't even driving. So I was like, well, I don't know what that's like either. So I think that kind of ignorance played into it. And then to have my dad alongside me meant that I was never in my own head looking at my watch and the data. We were just having conversations, laughing at each other, riding highs and lows. And I think that that helped me. It wasn't about the race, it was just about this experience.
With the knowledge you have now looking back on that, do you think like what percent of that, and I know we'll get into like kind of the mental toughness side and that side of the sport, but how much of that at age 15, like I feel like that's not normal, even as former athletes, to be able to just go out and run that many miles. How much, I guess the question for me is, how much of that do you think was kind of like the genetics of both, even just the soundness of like your hip joint and stuff? Like I know when I was 15, like if I anytime I went over 13, like instantly things started falling apart. So how much of that was just your genetic makeup versus I'm sure then the training kicked in after that, but with the knowledge you have now, what how do you reflect on that at 15, being able to just go out and do that?
Yeah, I definitely think that played like a huge role because even like my two older brothers have now started dabbling in running and have just a natural adaptation to it. Like they haven't had to, yeah, they haven't had that injuries and that kind of ebbing and flowing that usually comes with the body trying to adapt to a sport. Growing up, I played like a lot of team sports. I was more of a social sport person, but always had the engine. I was always put in center in netball or I was in the midfield because I could run. And it wasn't that I was training it. I just had, and also, I was very mentally happy just to do the same thing repetitively. I would swim laps just like constantly. I didn't need change in motion. I just needed to be in motion. And so I think that that's something that you either have or you don't. You either need to be stimulated and constantly like changing, or you're just happy doing the same thing repetitively.
Have you ever had your VO2 max tested? Because I bet you would have a really good test result.
I've had like a ramp test, so they haven't taken me to VO2, but they've kind of tried to guesstimate based on my heart rate and stuff. But the thing is like, I actually don't score that well on that test because I never work at that level. I am a diesel engine, fat burning all day. If I have to run across the street because I'm going to get hit by a car, I would bet the car would hit me. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, it's a cool theme that it's been fairly common on a lot of our episodes. We just recorded one with a UFC fighter. His name's Clay Guida. And I like how like, now it's such a big thing that you did, but for you downplayed it and you just jumped right into a 100-kilometer race, right? Clay was at his brother's his brother's professional fight. He wasn't in the fighter's world and they needed someone to step in on short notice. And he literally like went and got his wrestling shoes out of his car and fought his first professional fight on a whim. And then it would go on to have 60 plus fights in the UFC. And, it continues to be, fighting in that sport. So it's cool when you hear these stories that, that it's so nonchalant, but had you not done that, the path you would have chosen could have been completely different. And I think that's for anyone kind of listening, there's something to be learned from that of not letting, things, get in your head or to not be afraid to jump into things like that in fear failure. And I think, what you said is just another great example of that. And I just feel like a lot of the people we've talked to, Tony, it's like, that's the common theme. At the very beginning of whatever they accomplished, there was a moment where there wasn't hesitation, and they just did it. And then it opened up all these doors and that they probably never would have otherwise experienced. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I think you're actually spot on. And I think if you were to talk to like how I joined triathlon, it was the same thing. Like there was, and I think not carrying an expectation because I didn't have any and no one had any on me, like that underdog personality, like the UFC fighter, no one knew of him. He wasn't a ranked person. He wasn't talked about. So to go into the sport and just be like, me being here is against the odds. Me doing well here is against the odds. So like, you know, put me in and like, let me see what that was like. My pitch to the race director was like, I know that a 16-year-old running 100 kilometers, and especially there was a group of school boys that were walking the 100K, but the fact that I wanted to take 2 feet off the ground and I was a female became a massive talking point in the sport. It got a lot of publicity. The woman who was the race ambassador pulled out of being the race ambassador, didn't want to be associated with potentially harming someone. And I remember my dad on the start line saying, Lucy, there's a lot of people that want to pull you out of this race because they want to be right. But you got to smile the whole freaking way so that you tell people that, like, no, I like what I'm doing. I'm doing this because I want to. And I think that that mentality of kind of like running with a chip on your shoulder or kind of as a middle finger to people, that kind of like emotion takes you so far. And I think that that's something that is really, really special, and something that I always kind of come back to is that, like, at any point, especially my dad could have said, you know what, let's just wait till you're 18. Let's just wait to go through the normal process of like doing this thing. But he gave me permission to do what I wanted to do. And, you know, I knew that there was a price that could risk to it and a price to pay, but there's also a reward to reap. And I was more interested and focused on that.
Did people think he was pressuring you to run the race? Like, what was that the biggest hesitation?
Yeah, there was kind of that he was like a bad parent, and that there was like pressure from the parents. There was that I had like an exercise addiction, an eating disorder, that I was just like obsessive. Um, it was so crazy because of these guys, these school kids. Like I was like, I'm gonna walk too. Like these boys are walking, I'm gonna walk, but I just want to, like, when there's a downhill, break into a jog. Like it's really not that different. And yeah, there was a lot of like, we had a lot of publicity, and to be so young and especially just so new to it, we didn't think that it kind of shot us into a lot of people following the race, which was pretty crazy.
And what do you think fueled you? What was your motivation in the early years of your career?
I think it's the same as it's always been, which is just curiosity. You know, I have like a real like, let me try. And if I fail, I learn something. If I win, then great. And so I think that that's always been, you know, when I go for runs, even these days, I'm always like, oh, I wonder where this trail goes, or I wonder what on this map, what this summit looks like. And I think when I was so young, I was like, wow, my dad did that. I wonder what that feels like. Like, I want to try. And I always kind of went into it with little expectation of like, the finish line is not the reward. The reward comes from like just overcoming each moment and step from it. And I think that I've just, you know, I've always been that kid that just fell off, tried things, got hit, got in the wrong spot, was in the wrong spot at the wrong time, because I just wanted to try something new.
So 15, you run your first 100-kilometer race. What's the kind of the arc from there? Is it something you could like dive deep in and become obsessed with right away, or kind of when did you really kind of burst onto the scene and it become kind of a career for you?
Yeah, totally. So I was in school, obviously, when I ran it in 16, and then I ran it the following year, and ran 3.5 hours faster and won the race when I didn't have to run with my dad. And so people kind of like were kind of like, oh, okay, like, you know, she's not just doing it to jog next to her dad, she can actually do this. But then I kind of was in school, everyone was like, sponsors and everybody was like, finish school and then we'll talk contracts, like really sustainable, and really wanted to nurture the fact that ultra running is not a profession at this point. Like there was a few people making very small amounts of money, so it was kind of like, finish your schooling. It's not like basketball or football, you know. And then I, on my 18th birthday, ran that same race that my dad did in the Blue Mountains, which is Australia's biggest ultra. And I finished that amid my studies, and then went overseas and competed in some races, took my money, went for a gap year, and wanted to see how I stacked up against international fields. I won the youth sky running, which is like mountain running world championships. Got a sponsorship with Solomon, but nothing really shifted until 2017. So there was 5 years there where I was just going overseas, coming back with $20 in my bank account, working at a bakery, just trying to like scrape by, getting shoes as like a sponsorship, and super pumped about it. Felt like it was Christmas all the time. But then in 2017, 2018, I came third at an American race called the Western States 100 miles in California. This is like the most historical, it's called the grandfather race of the 100-mile distance. And I led the race for 100 kilometers, 60 miles. And then I ended up in third in the fastest Australian, or the highest Australian rank, one of the fastest women's times, and kind of blew onto the scene, and then signed a contract that, yeah, with Solomon, that remains my sponsor today, and kind of shot me to a bit of fame in the sport.
If we go from that first race at 15, then fast forwarding, it sounds like let's go to 2018 because that's where you left off. How had your passion for the sport changed at all? Had you like your internal state changed at all as it became more of a, at that point, starting to become a career? Was the spark still there? Was the love still there? And even the relationship with your body, how had it evolved over that time period?
Yeah, I'd say between 2012 and 2018, obviously I finished school, and so I was able to dedicate more time to it. But it was all in a very kind of healthy way. Up until 2017, it was a healthy way. In 2018, when I got into this 100-mile race, this race my dad had been trying to get into for 10 years. It's a race where you have to qualify, you go into a lottery. It's totally old school. They literally pull your name out of a barrel. There's like 300 spots, 10,000 people try and get in. And I got gifted because I was this up and coming young Australian. They gave me a bib. And when they gave it to me, I was like, okay, like I have to go all in, like no stone unturned. And I trained to the point of unhealthy, and I took my body and my mind. I was always like, just hold on till June 24th, you know? And then I had the race that I had. The thing was that I got addicted to feeling that strong and that fit and being in that state. And then I also, when I raced that way, overnight, I had, you know, a huge social media following boost. And they knew me as the athlete that stood on the start line of Western States. That was their first introduction to me. So I felt like I needed to stay looking that way, stay that fit, stay that relevant, keep racing. And so really my relationship and I outran my love of running was more in 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022. And that's where I kind of, yeah, hit the roadblocks. Before that, I was just used to this upward trajectory and was like, this sport's easy. I got this dialed.
As you kind of hit, and I don't know if rock bottom's the right word, but as you started to feel your feelings and the love kind of fade, was that something you recognized right away? I know Bear and I have openly talked about moments like that in our life and how like it usually takes a couple years. Some people who maybe are a little wiser than us recognize it right away and are able to kind of grow or evolve out of it. But how long did it take for you to kind of first off notice like, whoa, like not only I'm sure your dialogue had changed, like you even said your actions, your relationship with your body, I'm sure food. How long did it take you to start to recognize that you had kind of entered a place that was not the best version of Lucy?
So because I came third at Western States in 2018, I was top 10 gets to go back in 2019. And I remember, you know, I started training for 2018 at the end of 2017. And I was like, okay, it's the end of 2018. I got to start training for 2019. And I thought if I just did what I did, but more, I would move up the steps of the podium. You know, I would be second or I'd be first. And that was the expectation from everybody, was like, well, if on debut she can come third and she can lead for over half of it, the only way is up from there. And from the very get-go, things just weren't clicking, things weren't feeling good. But, you know, when you're an endurance athlete or when you're an athlete, you learn to just push through and to shove those feelings aside. And one of my biggest strengths and biggest weaknesses is that I am relentlessly optimistic about, if I just get through this session, maybe the next one will feel good. And if this race is bad, but the next one will feel good. And so I was kind of pushing and like nose to the grindstone and just really kind of, as I was doing that, pushing people and everything more and more away, really isolating myself because I was like, they're not helping me. I got to do this myself. I changed coaches because he was like, you're doing too much. And I was like, I'll find someone who tells me that I need to do more. And so that kind of like kept going. I stood on the start line of Western States in 2019 and just didn't want to be there. Like I, from the very get-go, hated it. And I remember running up the first hill, and I knew that I got to the top in the previous year in 48 minutes. And this time it was like 55, and it just spiraled me. And all day, I was just kind of like, you're slower, you're bigger, people are talking about you. This is like, you know, it was just kind of, my head was writing stories and checks I couldn't cash. You know, I was doing things, just not helping myself. Luckily for me, after that, COVID hit. And in Australia, we went into a pretty long, hard shutdown of almost 3 years. And that's when I kind of had to face my demons a little bit and be like, okay, Lucy, you can't travel and you can't run long distances. Who the hell are you? You know, like, when you take that away, because at the moment you're not a very good version of yourself. And so that was kind of when everything got brought to a halt and I couldn't keep running from my problems, literally and traveling wise. That's when I kind of had to, I assessed where I was, and for sure it was rock bottom. But at the same time, I was like, rock bottom's a pretty sturdy place to build from. So I began to make some changes and see if I could still find that love for the sport and wanted to keep going, or I was young enough to pivot and do something else.
Yeah, appreciate you sharing that. And in hindsight, were there any other, because it sounds like COVID, which of course was something that kind of caught everyone off guard. There was a bit of a blessing in there for you, is that it forced you to slow down. In retrospect now, are there a lot of moments that you look back and because what, at least my personal belief is that your body will, either through crisis or small little signs, start to show you that like you're usually revving your system too hot. And that can be work for some people, that can be a substance for some people, that can be a sport for some people, but it's wild that while you're in it, you can continue to keep rationalizing your way through it. But then once you finally, like you said, kind of hit, whether it's a rock bottom or you just have a catalyzing event that you start to re-perceive that moment, you look back and realize, holy shit, there was a lot of signs and symptoms of this. Is that something now in retrospect you have of like, whoa, look at all these little moments where I just kept ignoring my body or ignoring people who tried to kind of do somewhat of an intervention to some degree to let me know that like, hey, you're pushing too hard right now.
Yeah, 100%. And I feel very grateful in that, you know, my body never broke. I think when a lot of people push that stress, and especially in sport, they end up with something like a stress fracture, especially when there's an imbalance of like nutrition. You start to see things like REDS, relative energy deficiency in sport. And like for a female, you have your period can stop. And I had that. So I had so many things that kind of like flashing red signals. And what I've always said is like, before my body, I think, breaks, my brain breaks. Like, I just completely don't want to be a part of it. I don't want to train. And I can push through that for so long. But it was when COVID hit and, you know, I had 1 hour to run a day. And I had a 3-mile, 5-kilometer radius that I could run in from home, that I was just like, nah, screw this. Like, this is not what I'm here for. This is not what I do. And so I think, yeah, and then now coming out of it, it's amazing how many people were like, oh, it's, you know, it's incredible where you've come from, because we were so worried. And I was like, I didn't even register anyone worried or talking to me. Everyone just seemed to be like walking on eggshells around me, and just kind of like trying to lift me up and congratulate the small little wins, but not talking about the big elephant in the room, which was like the ultimate loss that I was going through.
Another theme that we've seen is, you know, and it seems to be more prevalent with hyperachievers, is people become over-indexed in their life on one thing. And we've posed this before, like, all right, hypothetically, if we were to remove that one thing from your life right now, how would you grade yourself in the other aspects of your life, right? And if you're not thinking like that, you can absolutely over-index into any area. You know, I've used the example of some of the guys in the special operations community, right? 20 years they go hard, or 20 plus, and then they get out and maybe they're divorced and they don't have a good relationship with their kids. And all of a sudden it's like, all right, man, you were an A+ in that one category and you dedicated your life to it. But now that thing in your life is gone. How are you everywhere else? You're D- everywhere. And it's not because they're bad dudes. You know what I mean? It's because they were so committed to one thing that was. So I think maybe you found yourself in that position where you had gone all in, and then maybe by the grace of, you know, COVID happening, you know, blessing in disguise, that kind of forced you to reevaluate that, because you literally couldn't continue. And I guess, how was that discovery, and how did, I imagine in the beginning that was hard to work through, to kind of redefine, you know, the balances in your life, and, you know, where do you now allocate all that extra energy that would have been spent, you know, out on the road, occupying your obviously your physical demands, but also the mental, the chase that you were experiencing.
Yeah, it was really tough. I think for the first year of COVID, no one knew how long this thing was going to go for. And so I was just like in that denial category. I was like, I can just keep running from this. But it was kind of that second year that I really sat down and I was like, okay, Lucy, if you're not the person that runs 30 hours a week and races 100 miles and gets pats on the back from crossing finish lines, who are you? I'm like, well, I'm a sister, I'm a daughter, I'm a friend, but I have other passions that I kind of hadn't even given time or energy to allow them to be a passion of mine. And so in COVID, I wrote a cookbook because I was like, I love nutrition. And it is something that, like, had I had more time and wanted to put energy into, and I also knew that I needed to sort that out. So it was kind of like this, let me put something into the world that also helps me just in the creation of it. I started coaching because I was like, what I'm going through and what I've been through, I don't want to see repeated. And especially, I only coach females in the endurance sports space because I know and can relate to them. And so I kind of picked up these other things and it just gave me more arrows to my bow. It was kind of like, okay, I love nutrition. I've written a cookbook. I've got a coaching business now. I'm passionate about kind of Solomon creating good women's running wear. Like, let me be a part of that process. Like, I don't want to just be an athlete to you that just stands on podiums and is a mannequin of what you create. I want to be a part of that process of shoes and gear. And, I see holes in the market because I am the market. I've been in this sport. And so kind of like having those things that when I finish a run, regardless of how that goes, I sit at my computer, I write training programs, I check in with other people's running, I get to do all these things that it's kind of like having, like, we also got a dog in COVID, and I feel like it's the same thing. Regardless of how that run goes, my dog is so pumped to see me. And it's just like, you're back. Thank gosh, like, let's hang out. And these are all like other things that, like, it's not how my running goes dictates how everything else goes, how my coaching is, how I am as a friend or a human, like they're very separate now. And it's really, really cool to be on the other side of it now and to see that everything has started to click together and now they can be not separate and they can actually be intertwined because I'm in a good place in all of them, that they help elevate each of them.
Love that.
And if we go one layer deeper, Lucy, so a lot of that sound, and of course what you said is awesome, and a lot of it sounds behavior based, meaning like changing some of your actions, diversifying what you're doing with your time. But if you go one layer deep to kind of the stories you were telling yourself, did during that time when you were kind of shifting as an individual, did you recognize any kind of thought patterns you had surrounding who you were? And then how were you able to take those? And I'm sure it took time, if that was the case, to kind of write a new story about, like, literally fundamentally who you are and who you show up as Lucy.
Yeah, I think that I just had to really remove the narrative of more is more, which is what we get taught. And it's like, it's this cycle and this snowball effect of, like, the more races you do, the more wins on the board, the more money you'll make, the more sponsors that'll be interested, the more likes you'll get on in social media, the more opportunities that will come. And I think that is like it's perpetual, like, it's crazy. And I was stuck in that in one facet of my life. And so I thought, well, if all I have to do is be like, that's the physical aspect. I just got to run, like, more is more. And I would only allow people into my circle that agreed with that. And I think that one of the things that I'm really passionate about and really enjoy is that we curate our social media and our podcasts that we listen to and the TV that we watch or anything that we absorb, is always kind of like in agreement of what we think. And so you're constantly like affirmed that, like, yes, this is the way to be. Like, I eat a plant-based diet, but I'm just like, that's the way to be. You just plant-based it's the answer. And what I really did to change it is I started listening and absorbing to other ideas around the world and other people doing different things and trying different ways and people doing carnivore and just kind of like being like, there's no one size fits all. There's no one answer, and things will work for a season and then they won't work. And what I was doing worked for a season and now it wasn't working. And being crazy is doing the same thing and expecting a different result. And that's what I was doing. I was just jamming a square peg into a circle hole at this point. And it became very obvious to me when I kind of like zoomed out and looked at who I was surrounding myself with, what I was absorbing in content, and like that just was putting that narrative in permanent marker rather than like in pencil, which gives you freedom to change it if it's not working.
Yeah, I mean, so much respect for you viewing, because it is crazy with technology and with the way algorithms work now. The ability to fall into an echo chamber is easier than ever. Now, the information's great and the access to information is great, but you have to be extremely careful that you're not doing exactly what you just said, where every source of media or every source of information you're consuming it has literally become an echo chamber. And like what you just said is an amazing exercise to break that echo chamber. Is you should be able to steel man the opposite of what you believe, meaning like you should be able to say why they believe. So in your case, say you're plant-based, you should be able to say the benefits of carnivore. That doesn't mean you need to change yours, but it's just a way to exercise that. Like, if you're very convinced that you have the absolute answer to something, go through that exercise and study as if you're trying to prove the opposite point. And if nothing else, you typically come out thinking like, whoa, I now have a mutual respect for that side and I'm able to speak on it. I can still choose to do whatever I want with my time and my actions, but I at least understand the other side. And I think we as a culture could use a healthy dose of that right now,
especially
just,
here.
Yeah,
right now.
just I'll speak for the United States. Yep. We could use a little more of that right now. So appreciate those wise words.
I want to talk a little bit about the Ultra-Trail. Hopefully I'm pronouncing it right, which I did learn French, so I think I am. Ultra-Trail du Mont-Blanc in France. Talk about that race. And then I realized then shortly thereafter you hit the Ironman World Championship. So talk about that experience, but specifically that first race. I'm just curious because I don't know anything about it and it sounds pretty legendary.
Yeah, it is. So it's the biggest trail race. It's like our Olympics. Ultra running will never be in the Olympics. It just takes too long. But it brings 10,000 people to this small town in France called Chamonix. The main event is 107 miles. It's 171 kilometers. It's got 33,000 feet of climbing, 10,000 meters. And it circumnavigates the Mont Blanc. So it goes from France into Italy, into Switzerland, back into France. I saw my dad do it in 2015 and it took him 44 hours. And I was exhausted just watching him do it. So I've taken a few years to actually stand on the start line myself. Last year I stood on the start line and I came in 10th place in 28 hours or something.
You got 10th out of 10,000 people?
10th female.
Yeah,
no, I think I was like...
That's still probably a lot, right? A few thousand women?
Yeah, I mean, I think you'd be surprised. I think I looked it up and it was 14% women in the field, which is like, we got to work on that.
It's still
for
over
sure.
1,000 of the best athletes in the world, and you were in the top 10. That's wild.
I was pretty stoked. I had a lot go wrong. It was just a very, very, very long day and night for me. And then when I did that last year, 5 weeks after that, I did the Kona Ironman World Championships. So this year it was 3 weeks for Nice World Champs. Last year it was 5. But this race is crazy. It starts at 6 p.m. on a Friday. And you hammer along the river. Everyone runs at a pace that I run probably my half marathon at. And then we enter into the mountains into the night. You run through the night, you enter Saturday, you run through Saturday. And last year I finished Saturday night. This year, so same thing. I finished 2.5 hours, 2 hours faster than last year. And I still got 10th place because the women are showing up and it's incredible. The race was just on from the beginning. It was 25 hours of just women back and forth, just super strategic, really fun. We had really warm weather. We had people, I was just passing people throwing up. I was passing people taking sleeps because they were tired. And it was just like, ultra running was like really, really cool for a day and a half out there. But it's an incredible sport and an incredible race. It's just, you come back into Chamonix having, yeah, gone for 26 hours, but lived about 10 years and learned so much because, yeah, they say you live life in a day when you run 100 miles. You just kind of go through like so many highs and lows and doubts and achievements out there by yourself, that it's a really special feeling to cross that finish line. And then for me to finish it and then stand on another start line of the pinnacle of triathlon 3 weeks later was like a pretty cool experience to have the two sports back to back.
Yeah, that's so cool. I want to talk about the race in France first, and then we'll get to the Ironman. But particularly that first segment through the night, I'm curious on kind of the mental journey that you all go through. There's a lot to think about, right? I mean, I guess since there's not much going on other than running, I would imagine the mind might race a little bit. It might be hard to occupy it with positive thoughts at all time. And I'm curious on any mental kind of strength methods you use to, kind of keep going, get to that next milestone. I know, I was able to go through SEAL training about 10 years ago. And one of the things that I learned that you had to do to survive was you broke it up into little chunks, right? Even to the point where you'd be like, all right, we're running. I'm trying to get to that telephone pole, and then I'm going to reset my brain. And then I'm trying to get to that. And it was that ridiculous. But by breaking it up into tiny little pieces, before you knew it, like the day's done and you're like, all right, I guess I'll do one more day. Do you have to do that in a race like that? Or I guess, how do you personally kind of endure that? And are there kind of common methods in your sport that people use? Or is it just kind of a free for all? And maybe y'all are just a little bit nuts in the head and, you just love it, or, or it's a significant challenge. But I'm just curious of your methods.
Yeah, well, you're spot on. Like, we break it down like that as well. So in this race, you see your crew or a checkpoint or an aid station kind of every like 3 to 4 hours. And that's a really big chunk and it's too much. So you break it down to like big climbs or cols or summits that you go over, especially if you know the course really well, which I was lucky enough to do. But for me, the nighttime is the most beautiful time because suddenly the mountains and the scariness of it, like the vastness, knowing that you've got to climb that mountain, when you can see it, it's very scary to see it up there. But at nighttime, that all goes to black, and all you have is your little light that you're lighting up, your head torch light. And so I'm always just like, just put your right foot into that light, then put your left foot. Like, I'm breaking it down really small. And I think it's so beautiful because if you just focus on what's right in front of you and don't let your mind wander to like, oh man, if this is how I feel now, and I've done 50 kilometers, I got to do 3 times this and I've got to do more climbing, and you just extrapolate and you just write this. I call it like time warping. Like, you just try and like time machine, and you can't predict what the future and how you're going to feel. So the nighttime is like, you have your patch of light, just focus on that, put one foot into it, put the next foot into it, and make each step count. And that's kind of like in the night, that really just like simplifies it. And my brain just loves it. It loves that it zooms in and all it's got is this little patch of light. In the daytime, I find it harder because I kind of know where it's going, and I look up at the mountains and it's like a cathedrals around you, and it's very intimidating. People are in your face, people are cheering for you, and that's lovely. But like, I'm just like I need low stimulus. I perform best, like, put me in the dark, put me in a bad room, put me like in a really hard situation where I'm not like on display. I just do best when I'm just chipping away by myself. And it's more the daytime that I feel like it's more intimidating to me. But we do the same thing. We break it down, and then you realize like, oh, that 10-kilometer section wasn't that bad. Let's go again. You come into a crew spot and your crew just lies to you and said, you look great. Like, here's some more food. Out you go again. And you're like, oh, okay. If you say that, then I must. And, you can just see their nose growing because they're lying so hard at you. But yeah, it's really just kind of remaining optimistic and letting yourself be comfortable being uncomfortable, because running is uncomfortable. Like, I don't think I think it's really, you know, when I write training programs and I say go for an easy 60-minute run, sometimes my athletes are like, easy 60 minutes, like nothing is easy about this sport. And I'm like, no, it never gets easier. You just get faster. And so you've just got to lean into that and be like, I'm doing a really hard thing and I accept that, but I've signed up for this. I've paid to do this and I've trained to do it. And so now it's like you get to celebrate and be curious about like, where has that landed you today? And that's kind of like my approach.
I love the headlight analogy. It's like it's literal, right? One foot in front of the other, because that's all you can see. If that's not a perfect analogy for life right there, for something hard, I mean, man, because so many people get into their head, and that's the same thing in like SEAL training, right? You get your ass handed to you the very first day, and guys are like, there's no way I can do this for not 21 months. Like, I'm just going to quit now because what's the point? There's no way I can endure this. But it's because they're thinking of the whole thing. You know what I mean? Where if it's all right, literally just one foot in front of the other, like you were doing, it doesn't, you don't, all right, I'll worry about that when we get there. But that's so cool. Like, I love that example. Because I figured the night would be harder for you, right? It's lonely. You know what I mean? You can't see anything, you know, you're just kind of in your own world. But for you, it kind of is the inverse of that. And that's really cool.
Yeah, I actually like whenever I go into these events, I do have like a anxiety around the night. Like it really, because the course markings aren't as obvious. Yes, it's dark, you know, there's all these kind of things that you don't know. But every time that I've ended up in the night, I've been like, oh, I love this. Like, and yeah, I think it's kind of, there's a beauty in it. You've just got to get to it. And it doesn't sound good on paper, but in the experience, it's amazing.
Lucy, it sounds, and I can only imagine with how many races you've done, there's been a ton of moments, both probably physically and mentally, where you've entered a space that most would probably, as Bear mentioned about SEAL training, like hit the tap out button right away. Are there any that come to the forefront of your mind thinking about like, this was, out of my whole race career, this was the worst, like the darkest moment I've ever been in during a race?
Yeah, so in COVID, it wasn't a race, but I did a traverse of the Lyra Pinta Trail, which is a 230 kilometer. I don't know what that is in miles, but I'm going to say
140?
230. Hold on.
No, maybe a little 158.
230 divided by 0.62. We get 142.6 miles.
Oh.
Holy.
Oh.
in the middle of Australia, so in the outback. It was, again, I don't know in Fahrenheit, but it was 45 degrees at the height of the sun.
122.
Is that?
Yeah.
There you
Oh my God.
And I went out there with two guys, and usually people hike it over 14 days. And I was like, had been so cooped up in lockdown that I was like, I'm going to do it in one hit. And so I started this thing.
Were you running or walking?
I was running. Well, I ran and then I walked and then I broke into a jog to finish.
Because we have that Badwater 100, right? That's like the epic one in Death Valley, I think. And yours
Correct.
was literally that, but add another 40 some miles to it.
Yeah.
That's insane.
It took me 54 hours. I slept for 3 minutes on the side of the trail, covered in ants by myself. But there was moments on that. One specifically was that there was heaps of rain that came, which is very unusual. And I thought I'd struck gold. Like I was easily going to get this fastest known time because I was going to have water. And there was this section where the river was full of water. It was a bit gross water, but I had a filter. But from the time I'd started to the time I got to that section, that water evaporated, but we didn't know that. And so I remember leaving my crew and climbing up this hill and then looking out, looking for that like glistening river to kind of use that to know where I'm going. And there was just nothing. There was no water in that I could see. And I was like, do I go back and try and find the guys and say, actually, I need more water than what I'd taken, but they'd left. So I ended up doing 8 hours before I saw them with no water in 45-degree heat, traversing this riverbed looking for just like any like puddle. It could have been of like cow pee and I would have been like, perfect, I'll take it. And I got to these guys. We made a film on it called Running Out. It's on YouTube. And these guys, they saw me. They'd obviously realized something had gone pretty wrong because I was pretty slow. And I come up the top of this ridge on this bluff, and my lips are black because they dried out with dirt stuck to them. I'm puffy and I'm completely dehydrated. I can barely speak because I have barely any water in me. And, in the moment, I remember looking at them in the eyes and trying to read their response to me because I didn't know what I looked like. And they did a really good job at being like, oh, that's okay. We've got coconut water with us. We've got water. We'll give you some ice. You'll be sweet. And then when I saw the footage, I was like, you should have stopped me. You should have, like, this is unhealthy. Like, this is beyond unhealthy. And like my dad, who was on the phone to the boys, and they were kind of like, yeah, she's like a little dehydrated, but she'll be right. Like, we've got her now. And dad was like, if I'd seen that footage and knew what you looked like, I would have been like, get my daughter off that trail. But it was definitely, after that, I was able to bring my body back, hydrate enough, and look after it. Then I went into the nighttime, it cooled down. But we set the fastest known time, 54 hours, across the finish line. And I was just like, this is like beyond, this is unhealthy. This is not the sport that I want to do. This is like, running breaks you down and builds you up. This just breaks you down. And it's something that, like, I share this film a lot at schools, and I'm always like, do not aspire for your running to look like this. Do not aspire to take your body to this level. It's not cool to hurt yourself like this. And I was poorly planned in that I didn't anticipate how much evaporation happens in this kind of heat. And yeah, it was just kind of like one of the wildest and most, the tools that I had to use in my toolbox, and what I added to it from that experience was just beyond anything. If I can endure that, I look at racing and I'm like, this shit's easy, because there's people out here, there's course markings. I'm not hallucinating. I'm not alone. And yeah, it's just like a totally different experience.
Pay a lot for perspective, right? Jesus, you paid the bill on that one.
One is far, and I can guarantee that you as a coach, although you recommend, like, and you give the advice that, hey, do not push it to this limit, like, I guarantee part of your gift that you can give to people now is that you kind of used yourself as a case study. Hey, push the limit. And because there are, I mean, anything, if it's a mental battle, physical battle, like those, the best learnings often come from places like that. But there's wiser ways to do it without having to break the system down. But I can imagine your gift now as a coach, and I'm sure just a mentor and a figurehead in the sport, is kind of you having exposed yourself to just extreme conditions like that, because it does, as Bear said, it gives you a level of perspective that most people can't relate to, but it definitely, I think, grounds you to in a way that that you realize, hey, that you don't need to push it to that extent to get the learnings from it.
Totally. Yeah. It was, I would never, I think like I did it so you don't have to.
That's it, exactly.
So trust me. Yeah. Lucy, what's the future hold for you?
So, I mean, I had a call with my coach yesterday. We were kind of talking about, we feel like we've always been like fire to fire with races and like my projects and stuff. And we want to kind of change that and be a bit more of like long trajectory and like the ramp up and be a little more sustainable about the whole thing. I'm always just like, I'm a yes person. I'm like, yo, you invited me to this cool race. I'll come. Yeah, I'll travel. I'll do that. I love it all. Next year, I really want to go back to the US. So this year was very France based, very Europe based. And so I have kind of like, there's 3 races of either returning to that Western States race in California. There's a race in the San Juans in Colorado, and there's a race in Leadville that's 100 miles that I would love to participate in. So like that's like the immediate racing kind of future, but otherwise I really have loved putting on camps and stuff, like bringing people together and like sharing food and sharing company, going for runs. And I think if you ever go for a run with a stranger, they become a best friend super quickly. There's like, it just breaks down. It's like when I was younger running with my dad, we'd have the conversations that are really tough to have, but it's not as intimidating as sitting across from the table where they're looking at you in the eye and like waiting for your response. When you're running, you're looking at your feet, maybe you pause a little bit for an uphill or a technical section, and then you pick the conversation back up. And I just feel like it breaks down the barriers. And I think that I love bringing people together and being like, we share one passion and it's one facet of our lives. We all have different jobs, situations, family, lives, whatever. But like, when you can share one passion, it really can be so great for you as a human being. And so I really want to put more of them on around the world. I've done one in South Africa, a few in Australia, but I'd love to do more of that because it brings more meaning to the sport for me as well.
Love that. Love that.
What's been your favorite spot in the US so far?
I love the San Juans in Colorado. I think it's some of the most beautiful wilderness, but I actually just love, like, I have spent a lot of time in California and Colorado, and I just think that they're some of the most beautiful places. And I just I love it. It feels like a second home to me over there.
Love it.
Well, Lucy, we appreciate you coming on. Super cool to hear your story and your perspective. I mean, so many good learnings from that. And we'll be rooting for you if you ever find yourself coming. We're in Virginia Beach on the East Coast, so I doubt you'll have any 100-milers.
I've never been to the East Coast.
We're like 3 hours from Washington, D.C., but if you happen to find yourself in our neck of the woods, definitely drop us a line. But I know you're very busy, so appreciate you sharing some time and some insights for us, and good luck in the future, and keep rocking and rolling.
Thank you so much for your time. And I honestly believe that podcasts like this that kind of have such a cool array of people and perspectives and sports and different that's the kind of stuff that people should be consuming, because it just gives you so much to take away and think about. And I think that that's really special. So thank you for having me on.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, for us, we're privileged to be able to talk to people like you guys, because there's such a variety of people that are accomplished in different disciplines. But then, since we've sat in 50 some interviews or 60 some, you start to spot common threads of things that apply across the board, right? And just in your interview, there was a couple that stood out right away. What fuels you? How do you kind of compartmentalize the mental struggles and one foot in front of the other? These are all common themes that we're seeing with elite people. And hopefully for the listeners, those are lessons we can extract, because it doesn't have to just apply to sport or human performance. These are things we can apply to life, right? If we're going through struggles. So we're lucky to be able to get linked up with people like you, and hopefully, because we're able to learn from it too. So thank you so much for sharing those insights.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
All right. And if we're ever in Melbourne, we'll hit you up. How about that? I said it right.
Please do.
All right, Lucy. Thanks again. Have a good morning.
Thanks, Lucy.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good night. Thanks, guys.